Just like many of the other Southland Chicago communities, Riverdale is not in good shape. And it might not be as abandoned as a Harvey or a Chicago Heights or a Phoenix, but in the coming years, you might not be able to distinguish the difference between Riverdale and its neighbor to the south, Harvey. I start the driving tour portion of the video right outside of Riverdale, as we're actually in the Chicago neighborhood that goes by the same name. Sometimes people will refer to the village of Riverdale as suburban Riverdale to avoid confusion with the neighborhood of Chicago. Well, as we head through, you'll see that Riverdale is crumbling, decaying, collapsing, emptying, and deteriorating. It's definitely seen better days. The village of Riverdale, Illinois is about 20 miles south of the Chicago Loop and 5 miles west of the Indiana state line. If you've seen my other Southland Chicago area videos, you've heard me mention that this is all a part of the Calumet Region, which includes areas as far east as Michigan City and a large area of the south side of Chicago. Essentially, the Calumet Region is the name given to the land that is within the Calumet River watershed. The Calumet region historically has been heavily reliant on blue-collar industries, such as steel manufacturing, auto assembly, other auto parts factories, coal, and chemical products, among other things. Over the years, throughout not only the Calumet region but throughout this country, the amount of industrial jobs have fallen severely, as many of you know. If you didn't know, maybe you should, I don't know, put the cement glue bottle down, stop sniffing it, and pay attention. Anyway, it's had a huge negative impact in this large populated area. So yeah, Riverdale is no exception to suffering from the region's economic downfall. The town's population peaked at 15,800 back in 1970, but today, that number is just above 10,000, and by the next census count, you can expect it to be well below 10,000. In fact, the most recent census in 2020 shows a population decline of 21.3% over a 10-year stretch, which is the largest percent of decline that the village of Riverdale has seen since it started its economic downturn. Well, before we get into all of what Riverdale is like today with all of the numbers and stats and hijinks and hilarity, let's talk about some of the history of the village and how it became to be, shall we? Riverdale was founded back in 1892, the same year that the neighboring city of Dalton became its own village, while Chicago annexed the area that today is known as the Riverdale neighborhood back in 1889. George Dalton was the first modern European settler in the area, and he operated a ferry across the Little Calumet River. That ferry began operation in 1835 until a toll bridge was built in 1842 at today's Indiana Avenue crossing over the Little Calumet River. The bridge was often referred to as Riverdale Crossing. Well, Riverdale began as a farming community with Germans and Dutch mainly inhabiting the community. The first railroad came through in 1852, and by 1880, there were as many as 6 railroads that passed through Riverdale, with as many as 10 passing through Dalton to the east. With all of the railroads passing through and with the Little Calumet River, this land was prime for industrial growth. Industries early on included the Riverdale Distilling Company. The Pullman Car Factory was located in the nearby Pullman neighborhood of Chicago. There was a large paint factory that was later operated by Sherwin-Williams. There was lumber, there was barrel making, there were sugar refineries, and other agricultural-related things. This activity attracted more immigrant groups such as Irish, Swedish, and Russians. In the early 1900s, the Acme Steel Company began operations along the Little Calumet River, and that became one of the larger factories in the area. Here's a neat map of Riverdale back in the early stages of mass development. You can see here that while some of the streets had been laid out, most of the land was undeveloped. This shot was taken on April 4th, 1939, which is around 85 years exactly prior to me uploading this video in late April of 2024. It's pretty amazing that a photo like this is available with such good quality. Once the World War II era was over, white flight became in full effect in the Chicago region, which greatly benefited Riverdale. With the commuter rail serving the community now in the 1950s and with the construction of I-57 and I-54, that made life in Riverdale even more ideal. You could escape the crowded city where your job is located and you can live in the much quieter suburbs. That was the trend back then. In 1960, Riverdale's population was 99% white. That didn't last long though, as white families in the following decades continued to move further and further away from the city proper, and away from the industrial areas. Over time, black families from the south side of Chicago were starting to move out of the city proper as well, and Riverdale was one of the dozen or so south side Chicago suburbs that they moved to. Housing was affordable, the community was safer, and everything about it was more ideal. That being said, the community went from being 99% white in 1960 to being 86% black by 2000. Now, we're going to start seeing some abandonment. So back to where we were, as not only did the upper middle class families move out of Riverdale, which depleted the tax revenue for the city, and not only did many of the industrial jobs leave the area, which also depleted the tax revenue for the city, but throughout the later half of the 20th century, when the city of Chicago tore down the public housing in the city, the Section 8 residents were displaced and were forced to live elsewhere in the suburbs and, quite frankly, throughout the rest of the state of Illinois. But as a result, many of the Southland suburbs, including Riverdale, saw an increase in gang activity as, quite frankly, that's a part of the population that was being displaced in Chicago. That being said, this is a failed public housing project on the northern edge of Riverdale. Yeah, these weren't ever public housing projects. I bet all of you Chicago area know-it-alls have already started to type out your comment and tell me how I'm wrong. Well, yeah, not this time. Fooled ya. That's right. Sorry. Hit and hold that backspace button and move on with your day. Alright, so anyway, these were always townhomes meant for home ownership. Over time, slumlords ruined them by not keeping up with their properties. You can't really blame anyone for thinking that these were some projects at first glance. I've seen many articles and other YouTube videos when researching this area referring to this place as projects, but they are not that. Anyway, they look very similar to some abandoned public housing buildings that you can find in Fort Heights further south. At first, even I was guilty of assuming that what we're looking at here was just another Cook County public housing project gone wrong. But nope. Originally, there were 397 townhomes in this neighborhood. Built in the early 1960s to accommodate workers in the nearby factories that once employed thousands of workers, the development is called Pacesetter. These were the first multi-unit residential buildings in the Village of Riverdale, as before that, all of the residential zoning in this town was made up of single-family homes. Well, over time, the townhome development became more like an apartment complex as slumlords, if you will, started renting out the townhomes for cheap without properly keeping up with them over the years. Crime and gang activity started to become a problem here, with the worst activity occurring in the 90s. So essentially, this place became a Section 8 complex without actually being an official Section 8 complex, or a housing project operated by the Cook County Housing Authority. In some ways, the lack of having a revenue flow funded by the government kind of made this place even worse than if it were to have been a public housing project, because at least if it was a public housing project, the state and the county would have been given this neighborhood some money to work with. Instead, with the lack of home ownership and with the landlords not caring about the state and condition of their properties, with overcrowding of the neighborhood, crime and gang activity, that's what destroyed this place over the years. A Chicago Tribune article from November 2007 mentions how ground was broken to fix up 90 of the 397 homes in the neighborhood, costing about $38 million. It took about 18 months for the renovations to be completed, and today, Low Avenue, which sits just west of the maze of abandoned buildings that we're in right now, was fixed up pretty nicely actually, and it still looks nice today, as you can tell from the street view shot. Well, the article continued to mention how throughout the following 8 years, the entire 42-acre neighborhood was going to look a lot different according to plans, but clearly that didn't happen, as 8 years following 2007 would be 2015, and it's been an additional 9 years since 2015, so about 17 years total. Despite the original redevelopment plans never coming through, the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, Planning Council, or whatever this group is, announced a plan for improving a dozen or so housing developments in Chicagoland, including Pacesetter, which means clearing out all of the buildings, as they're able to. So once a lease ends or someone moves out, nobody is going to be able to move back in, or so they say. Kind of weird to see a listing for one of the townhomes on Redfin. I mean, heck, it's yours if you want it, though. If you want to cough up $40,000 and you think you can turn it into something, yeah, sure. But I wouldn't count on it if I were you. All right, well, as you can tell, as we've driven through, there's already been a clearing out of a lot of the buildings, so that's good at least, because let's face it, these buildings need to all be torn down and redeveloped for housing that is more up to code. It would be like a fresh start, and yeah, that's what this place needs. So I guess Low Avenue was phase 1 of the project, even though it happened 13 years prior, and the rest of this neighborhood is going to be phases 2, 3, and 4. And what they're looking for is 375 new homes to be built within phases 2, 3, and 4, with a rental unit cap of 40%, so that over half of the homes can be dedicated towards home ownership. So with phase 1 having 90 homes and with phases 2, 3, and 4 having 375 homes, that means that altogether there will be 465 homes. How's that for problem solving in second grade math? Good? Pretty good? Okay. So that was announced in 2020, and the question now is if those plans will ever go through. Only time will tell, really. I mean, there's been so many times that redevelopment plans have been announced and have made a community excited, but unfortunately, in poverty-stricken communities such as Riverdale, very rarely do these announced plans ever go through because it's tougher for these communities to secure funding for such developments. So, do I believe that it will happen?
Nope.
Not really. I believe that the buildings will get torn down at one point, but I don't believe that 375 homes will be developed here. Maybe it will return back to nature, or maybe it'll be used for some kind of a park. I don't know, but let's say I'm wrong, and let's say that the plan does go through. There's no way that it happens within a timely manner. I mean, the plans originally were announced 17 years ago, and nothing has happened yet other than some of the buildings getting torn down. And for the buildings that are still standing, well, it's safe to assume that they're in worse shape today than they were 17 years ago. Well, here's another Pacesetter property listed for sale. It's listed for $5,000, but wait, there's a catch. I mean, of course there is, right? The property is being sold as is, yeah, we assumed that. Buyer will assume back taxes going back to 2013. Yeah, no thanks. Buyer to pay water bill equaling up to $4,325 and village liens of $900 on top of the owed back taxes for 11 years. In order to confirm the exact amounts, you have to submit an FOIA request to the Village Hall Water Department. Yeah, like anybody's gonna buy that place.
Nope.
Look, it's unfortunate what's happened to this neighborhood, but it's clear and obvious that changes have to be made here, and the better economic decision would be to tear down all of these buildings and replace them with new ones, just like how the Village of Riverdale wants to. So yeah, we'll see what happens. There used to be a street that connected this portion of the neighborhood with the redeveloped area along Low Avenue, but that street has been removed, which is even more proof that Riverdale plans on continuing to demo these buildings one by one as time goes on. I mean, seriously, they have streets blocked off in the neighborhood, cars up on blocks everywhere, shattered glass, probably even bullet casings laying around, graffiti threatening to shoot people, boarded up windows and doors everywhere, trash, tree logs, overgrown weeds, overgrown bushes. Yeah, this place is on life support. But before we leave Pacesetter entirely, this neighborhood is near the intersection of 138th and Holstead. When looking at some old aerial photos of the area, I couldn't help but notice that a drive-in theater used to be at the intersection of 138th and Holstead. It was called the Holstead Outdoor Theater. The theater opened in 1950, and it had 4 screens that had spots for 300 cars. There was even a miniature train ride for the kids. The theater closed, however, in the late 80s before reopening for 1 year in 1991. After that, it was closed for good, and it was demolished by 1995. Today, a post office and a fire station take up that land. Alright, well now we're making our way towards a different apartment community, and as we make our way there, you can see that a large portion of Riverdale doesn't really look all that bad despite the loss of 5,000 people over the last 20 years, or about a 33% decline of its population from 2 decades ago. Riverdale looks a lot like its neighbor to the east, which is Dalton. Smaller homes, but overall well kept up with homes, not terribly ugly despite a travel site recently ranking Riverdale as the ugliest city in Illinois. I mean, I feel like there's plenty of Illinois cities that are way uglier than Riverdale. Maybe it's time that I create my own lists, since I've seen so many places over the last 4 years. But yeah, outside of Pacesetter and some parts of this upcoming apartment community, I've seen a lot uglier places, and so have you if you've watched this channel for a while. But let's talk about the current economic stats for Riverdale, since we haven't done that yet. The population is down to 10,200, and you can expect that to be in the 4-digit range soon. It's a decline of almost 4% since the 2020 census. The median household income is $41,000 per year, and only 16% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher. The median value of owner-occupied housing units is $97,000, and the poverty rate is extremely high, as it's at 31.4%. Here we are at the apartment community, and there's a couple of apartments here and there with boarded up windows and doors, and you'll see that as we go through, but onto the crime rates, as they're not terrible actually. Things were a lot worse here back in the 90s. The violent crime rate is only 401 out of every 100,000 residents, while the property crime rate is only as high as 2350 for every 100,000 residents. There's a lot of other cities in the Chicago area, especially in the Southland region and the greater Calumet region, that have a higher crime rate than Riverdale, so not much of a worry there. Well, on to the next talking point now as we drive through this apartment community, as many of you who are watching this video probably know about Dalton's mayor.
Loser.
And what's going on there. You've probably already seen my video on it too, and if you haven't, what the hell's wrong with you? Go watch it now. Well, Riverdale has its own crooked mayor. Meet Lawrence Jackson, the mayor of Riverdale. Jackson was accused in a civil lawsuit of accepting secret funding for his trucking business from a waste hauling firm, and then lying about it in a civil deposition. Jackson and his wife started a trucking company in 2018 called Centennial Holdings, but according to a Chicago Tribune article, apparently they didn't know anything about the trade, and they invested no money into starting the business. Well, it turns out that it wasn't even Jackson and his wife that ran the company, rather it was his friends, James and Kelly Bracken, who owned a separate company called Riverdale Materials, but despite not running the business, Jackson and his wife received financial benefits from that company. But yes, it was James and Kelly Bracken who poured all of the money into Centennial Holdings. They provided a loan to fund the startup costs and the ongoing everyday expenses, which included trucks, fuel, insurance, maintenance, and licensing, among other things. The Brackens attempted to cover up the funding of the loans by going through third-party operators who then passed the money onto Centennial Holdings. Well, this activity was noticed by a competitor in the business who was much more established, that being Tri-State Disposal. Back in 2017, Tri-State brought to the attention of the village board that Riverdale Materials was hiding illegal waste dumping on its property, which polluted the environment. Well, Jackson felt the need to remove any potential drama from the room, so he fired the chair of the village's Zoning Board of Appeals. Soon after, the board approved Riverdale Materials' business application, and the business celebrated the mayor with a sign outside of their business and on their website, giving him the credit for bringing more small businesses to Riverdale. In March of 2018, the Village of Riverdale told Tri-State Disposal that they will no longer be using them for their garbage pickup, in which Tri-State has done that for the Village of Riverdale for many years up until that point. During the next month, Jackson ended up sending Tri-State a letter that accused the company of harassing communication, and despite Tri-State still being under contract to being the garbage pickup company for the Village of Riverdale, Jackson paid Riverdale Materials, the competing company, $18,000 that year for a spring cleanup in the village. Yeah, Mayor Jackson loves his trash. We'll just call him the garbage man. Well, the biggest problem in this whole thing is that Jackson lied about knowing of Centennial Trucking's relationship with Riverdale Materials. He also lied about an accountant handling different parts of the business. It didn't help that Riverdale Materials donated $30,000 to Jackson's mayoral campaign, along with an additional $8,000 through other businesses that the Brackens owned in Markham. The Brackens own many businesses and have actually donated to other corrupt mayoral campaigns throughout the Chicagoland region. Well, Tri-State ended up filing a civil lawsuit against both Jackson and the Village of Riverdale in 2018, and 5 years later, in November of 2023, Tri-State won and Jackson was indicted, although Jackson is still the village mayor as of April 2024. There is another case of corruption, although an older one, back in 2014 when real estate developer John Thomas stole $375,000 of Riverdale taxpayer money to pay off his own personal debts. That money was supposed to be used for real estate projects here in Riverdale, but it was used for his own personal gain. At least the corruption here in Riverdale is nothing like what Dalton is seeing with their current mayor.
Loser.
But it's still corruption nonetheless, which seems to be way too common in not only Chicagoland, but in the state of Illinois. Well, people, it is now that time. What did we learn in this video? We learned that you can't always trust a startup garbage company, and you can't always trust City Hall faculty, but you can always trust Chris's livability score. First up is education, and while Riverdale doesn't have a high school within the village limits, students attend Thornton High School, which is located in Harvey to the south. The school ranks poorly in math, reading, and science and is one of the lower performing schools in all of Chicagoland. It gets a 3 out of 20. Crime is next, which, once again, isn't really all that bad here. It gets an 11 out of 20. The third category is downtown. And downtown Riverdale is where we are right now. It consists of a stretch of 144th Street on either side of the railroad tracks. It looks pretty run down despite having a few chains like a CVS pharmacy and a Chase Bank. It has a Metroline station, so that's something at least. It gets a 6 out of 20. Economy is next, in which there's not much good to say about the economy of Riverdale. The best thing about it is that it's a part of a larger metro area where you can find better opportunities in other nearby cities. It gets a 4 out of 20. The next category is recreational opportunities, and really there's not much here. It's an urban environment, it's a old, rusted out industrial area. The Little Calumet River is heavily polluted, and you have some sand dunes along the lakeshore in Indiana, but that's like 45 minutes away from here, so recreational opportunities, it gets a 4 out of 20. The history of Riverdale is interesting, but it's not anything too spectacular, really. It's just another place with strong industrial roots. It gets a 7 out of 20. Amenities is next, and there's not much inside of the village proper, but head outside of it and you can find a selection of some low-end shopping and restaurant amenities in Dalton and South Holland. It gets a 5 out of 20. Last up is cost of living, in which the cost of a home in Riverdale is dirt cheap. In fact, here's the current inventory on the market according to Zillow. Yeah, dirt cheap. The biggest expense being that it's in Cook County and the state of Illinois, so there's all kinds of hijinks and hilarity there with property taxes. But overall, the Chris livability score for Riverdale, Illinois is 59 out of 160, putting it towards the bottom out of all of the cities that I've done this for so far. Well, hey, if you enjoyed this video, I've referenced the neighboring city of Dalton quite a bit throughout this video, and I have a video of it here, if you haven't seen it already. Also, my Chicago suburbs playlist might be of interest to you. Peace.